Thank you for waiting, those of you who tuned in right on time. We just finished action on the House floor, and so I was a little delayed getting over here. We were actually completing debate on a pretty historic piece of legislation that will make Illinois the first state in the country with a comprehensive police body-worn camera law that also includes some other reform issues. Very specifically, the biggest piece of it is the Body-Worn Camera Act that puts into place the kinds of equipment, the ways that it will be utilized. There are other protocols involved as well, including some components that will improve both record keeping and the ways that police and community interact, some training, some independent investigations of officer-involved deaths, uniform crime reporting, and another piece that was pretty controversial and difficult to sort out is what's being referred to as stop and frisk data collection. Here in Illinois, we have a pilot project that collects data on traffic stops. This will add pedestrian stops to that, so that any significant interaction between an officer and an individual on the street will create a record that that will record data, that will record outcomes, and that individual who was involved in the interaction with the officer will get a copy of it on the spot. There are chokehold prohibitions, standards, a database on officer professionalism and conduct. The Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board will track evidence of misconduct or incidents of misconduct across the state, and keep that available to any chief administrative officer. And make sure that the crime labs have sufficient funding and technology available to appropriately handle forensic biology and DNA evidence. So that just passed the House and goes over to the Senate with significant bipartisan support and more significantly, significant involvement from all stakeholders. There was no opposition from law enforcement. They were deeply engaged throughout the process. The lead sponsor, who chairs the House Criminal Law Committee, LG Sims, really did an amazing job of keeping everyone at the table and finding agreement. So he's to be commended because Illinois really stands out in a really positive way today, having passed that. As some of you know, we are quickly approaching the end of the legislative session. We are scheduled to adjourn at the end of May. May 31st is our scheduled adjournment date, and I have now said scheduled a couple times because we don't have a budget ready to go, and that things are not looking very promising in terms of a budget agreement. So it is possible that we will go over that deadline. But it is also the deadline to pass substantive legislation. So we'll start there and we'll get to the budget in a minute. My three most significant pieces of legislation this year are moving along well. The House Bill 494, which addresses barriers to employment for people with nonviolent criminal backgrounds in school systems, and that doesn't just mean working as a teacher. That could be as simple as being a parent volunteer in a school, or working for a delivery company that drives trucks to schools and drops off supplies or foodstuffs, and so really has such a wide-ranging impact on a community and the kinds of jobs that folks might be eligible for. 494 removes those lifetime barriers and puts in place a standard of local control, whereby local school districts can know fully a person's background and make an informed decision about whether their criminal history should impact their employment decision or not. And that has now passed both the House and Senate. Again, I'm happy to report with really wonderfully bipartisan support, and is awaiting the governor's signature. House Bill 218, which provides for a uniform civil enforcement of cannabis laws in Illinois, has also passed both chambers. 218 would create a ticket, a civil ticket, a civil fine for possession of 15 grams or less of cannabis, and then moves the criminal penalties down appropriately or accordingly with regard to other amounts of possession, so that we have fewer people serving in IDOC or in our local jails for what is low-level possession, not involved in dealing in any way. And that, as I said, has passed both chambers. There's some cleanup language on another bill that addresses the expungement component of the bill, that makes it possible for the clerks and the courts to handle that automatic expungement in a way that will mechanically work. And that bill is still pending, and they will both go to the governor together. My third priority bill this year is House Bill 217. House Bill 217 has passed the House. It's now in the Senate, and it will it bans the practice of conversion therapy, which is a widely discredited, non-scientific form, really, of abuse. In many ways, using the word therapy in that sentence is a complete misnomer. This is based on a lack of science, a faulty premise that homosexuality is a disease that can be cured in some way. Survivors of these practices have come to us with all sorts of horrific stories of, from the very simple, family rejection and family abandonment. And that's not simple. I mean, the therapist saying you can't interact with your father anymore because he clearly wasn't a strong enough male figure for you, to really horrifically abusive tactics that should never be performed on anyone, much less someone who claims to be a person of health, of healing. And so, we in Illinois are poised to join New Jersey and California and Oregon and Washington, D.C. in banning this outrageous practice. The bill yesterday cleared the Senate Executive Committee and now advances to the full House. Hopefully it could be voted on as early as tomorrow, which is very exciting, and I'm looking forward to getting that one done. Again, we have strong bipartisan support. The Senate Republican leader, Christine Rodonio, sits on the Executive Committee and was among the yes votes on the committee, as well as Republican Senator Chris Nybo, who had some really wonderful commentary in committee. We had fabulous witnesses. There's an amazing young man who has served as a witness in both chambers. Curtis Galloway is a survivor who shares his story of he and his parents actually not seeking conversion therapy. They were seeking therapy just to make sure that as a young man he was exploring these feelings about himself in a healthy and positive way. And they found themselves in a horrific scenario where that nearly tore their family apart. And I am grateful to Curtis for his willingness to share his story, for his generosity of spirit and his bravery to protect other kids who may not have the wherewithal he had to come through that. Such a beautiful and strong human being. So I want to thank Curtis, as well as doctors from Lurie Children's Hospital, who provided some scientific foundation for why this is not okay. We are currently, while there's still some substantive bills pending in other categories, we are focusing now towards the budget. The inability to come to an agreement on really even a process by which we pursue the budget has led to a democratically introduced budget that still makes significant cuts. Still cuts almost every agency below what last year's funding levels were, yet has managed to restore critical services. The human services budget that the House passed yesterday, I believe, has put back into place some of the cuts that Governor Rauner's proposed budget had eliminated, that we actually had eliminated once before and found it too expensive, that we didn't save anything by eliminating things like adult dental or podiatry, or imposing a 4-drug cap on mental health drugs. And so we restored those pieces back into that budget. In addition, the governor's budget also proposed eliminating services to DCFS wards who are 18 to 21. Anyone with children, I mean, I have a 14-year-old, and in 4 years, he's not going to be ready to live on his own, not completely. And the idea that some of the most vulnerable youth in our state should be cut off with no safety net whatsoever the minute they turn 18 is preposterous to me and to many others, and really is short-sighted in the reality that will require much more expensive services if they encounter our criminal justice system or find themselves homeless and unhealthy and perhaps suffering from mental health issues. Providing that ongoing service and helping them transition into adulthood is not just the compassionate thing to do, it's really the fiscally responsible thing to do. On the public safety side, we've heard from a lot of folks in our community concerned about the cuts to ceasefire. That's something that I have been fighting all session long because, as many know, our ceasefire program was defunded in the middle of this year, so it's not operational right now. But they were also facing an enormous cut in their budget for next year, a cut that would have not just impacted Rogers Park and Uptown ceasefire, but ceasefire sites all over the state would find themselves unable to operate. The budget bill that we passed for public safety appropriations earlier this week restores all but a small amount of the funds to the ceasefire line item. Like everything else, there will be a cut, but not one that is devastating to the program. The bill does include an increase, although not as large as the one the governor had proposed, to the adult redeploy program, another program that has huge value to our state. It does a great deal of good work in terms of, not only in terms of keeping people out of the prison system, but making our courts more efficient and keeping people from returning to the criminal justice system. So those are some of the highlights. We've also heard a great deal from folks concerning questions about the proposal from Noble Charter Schools that includes a possible high school site in Rogers Park. And as many of you know, I joined in with elected officials from all over the lakefront, signing on to a letter opposing not just a site in Rogers Park, but also a proposed site in the Uptown Lakeview area. Those are contained in 2 different applications. And so this week at the CPS board meeting, Chicago Public Schools board meeting, the Noble folks postponed their application. They pulled back their application on the Uptown Lakeview site, but that does not impact the application that includes the Rogers Park site in 2 different phases of the process. And so that the one that affects our community or potentially affects our community is still pending. It's unclear what's going to happen with the Uptown Lakeview site, but those do continue. There is an event coming up that has been organized by folks in the community, No to Noble, and I'm looking to Matt right now because I can't remember the date of the event.
I'll find out.
Okay, we'll come back to that. I meant to write that down. I believe it's June 8th, but we'll get that out there. Other bills that we've gotten lots of calls and notes about, one involves the bobcat hunting bill. There's a bill that would instruct the Department of Natural Resources to create I believe they call it a population management plan that would provide for a hunting season for bobcats. There are some areas in the state where the bobcat population has indeed grown, but other parts of the state where it hasn't. And from a conservation perspective, there is deep concern that eliminating one of the very few apex predators in the state could have a really horrific impact on the environment here. So we're being very handy today. The bill has passed both the House and Senate, but it has passed in different forms. So it will be coming back to the House for another vote. I voted no on it then. It does have a significant majority, so it remains to be seen whether we're going to be able to defeat it on our next effort. it did pass. It passed both chambers last year with significant majorities, and the former governor, vetoed it. We believe this governor will sign it, so it's important that we find an opportunity to do that now. But I think it's a long shot, but we'll see. Going back very quickly, the No on Noble event is Monday, June 8th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. at the Loyola Park Fieldhouse, which is 1230 West Greenleaf. I believe that in addition to myself, that Representative Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky has agreed to be there as well. That this is a community event organized by a coalition that has come together around concerns about the possibility of a third charter high school in our community, and worries over what impact that might have on all of our neighborhood schools, but most significantly on the incredible progress that Sullivan High School has made, and our belief that this could really put the brakes on that and do serious harm to what has really turned into a jewel in our community, that Sullivan, the amazing progress they've made, and I don't want to see that end. Another bill related to charter schools that we've gotten a lot of correspondence on concerns lifting the cap on charter schools. That bill is still pending. It's unclear whether it has enough support to move forward. It's a House bill still in the House, which signifies this close to the end that it doesn't have a lot of opportunity, but we say in Springfield, May is the month of miracles. Things pop and move quickly when you think that they can't anymore. So I am keeping an eye on that bill, and I will be opposing it. I'm going to move to questions that folks have sent in advance. Pierre Rowan sends a question regarding tax revenue. My understanding is that any income tax increases would require passage of a state constitutional amendment if there is a deviation from the flat tax model. I thought Illinois voters already voted on this issue. Does this vote still have to go through the state assembly for vote and approval? If so, where does that issue stand? So Pierre, what was on our ballot last year at election time was what's called an advisory referendum. We have not voted on a constitutional amendment. And the advisory referendum was a progressive income tax, but rather for what's being referred to as the millionaire's tax, which would put a 3% surcharge on adjusted gross incomes of over $1 million. And you are correct that that was on our ballot, and it passed with overwhelming margins really all over the state. However, that bill, so what we would have to do in order to implement that, just as we would have to get a progressive income tax, would be to first amend the state's constitution. And the process for doing that involves both chambers of the General Assembly passing the constitutional amendment with a supermajority, and in the House that means 71 votes. And then it would go to the next general election ballot, in this case, the November 2016 ballot, and then that would require also a supermajority vote of the voters. In the case of the millionaire's surcharge, that would then be immediately effective, whereas with a constitutional amendment eliminating our flat tax, we would then, as a General Assembly, take that mandate from the constitutional change, removing the required flat tax, and create a new tax code for the state of Illinois based on the principles of a progressive tax. But it would take some time for the General Assembly to craft a new tax code. So that would delay any potential benefits in terms of revenue until that could be done. So where we are right now is we still have our flat tax. We were unable to pass the millionaire's tax constitutional amendment this week. We failed by 3 votes, and we're still very much at square one with that. Other areas of revenue are still being explored, including broadening our sales tax base, perhaps trying to find a way to restore the income tax that was rolled back this year, looking at closing corporate tax loopholes and others. But in this instance, our governor has said that he will veto any new revenue that we send to him before we implement some of his turnaround agenda, which is a very very not pro-middle class, pro-working families agenda that seeks to take on organized labor, seeks to do harm to folks who are injured on the job, and many other pieces. So this is very much a standoff that we have. Carlene Mostek has a question on the LaSalle Street tax. Currently, there are two proposals for this revenue-raising tax levying various tax amounts on high-volume trading. The UK, Switzerland, Hong Kong, and France, in addition to other countries, and haven't seen negative effects. So I think that means that they've done it and haven't seen negative effects. We need this revenue desperately. Why can't we settle on this? This has been proposed several times. It never gets out of Rules Committee. I think perhaps one of the biggest differences between those countries and what we see here is that it does seem a more reasonable threat to say you're going to move your servers to Indiana than to say you're going to leave the country. And they wouldn't even have to leave their building. They could just put their servers in Indiana. That is one of the main objections I hear as I talk about the LaSalle Street tax around the Capitol. It's something that I do support. But you know, with that, we still need 60 votes for it, and that is one that has been harder to come by because that threat, as I said, the idea of moving your servers across state lines is a much smaller effort than leaving the country, and so that would be the primary objection that folks here that are using as a reason to oppose it. Roberta Rubin raises questions concerning pension tax and seniors. Will there be a tax on pensions? As of right now, that's not on the table. We are one of very few states that don't tax retirement income, but it has not come out in bill form in any way. There have been talks over the years of, you know, whether we do it in some sort of needs-based way. But that there are no bills around taxing pensions. What services for seniors will be cut as a result of budget cuts to the 2016 budget? That remains to be seen. A lot of the things that have been restored in the Democratic budget that we're currently debating and passing are the things that were taken out in Governor Rauner's proposals, including funding for the transit subsidies for low-income seniors, many of the community-based services, the home care services that allow people to stay in their homes longer, and the funds for nursing homes and other residential facilities that allow folks to live with some dignity. The budget cuts included $4.6 million from PACE Paratransit, $100 million cut to the Department of Age and Community Care Programs. As I said, we restored that. There's something called the Determination of Needs score that determines whether your residential care can be paid for by Medicaid. The governor's proposal suggested raising that score pretty significantly. That score raise has been removed from the Democratic budget. He did cut adult dental from Medicaid. We've restored it. He eliminated exemptions from the for prescription limit. We restored that, and he had proposed a 1-hour reduction for in-home care per week, and our bill does restore that. Nancy Solomon asks about the unemployment offset. Currently, Illinois is the only state in the country that acts on its ability to offset the unemployment benefits of a person on Social Security who also loses their job and goes on unemployment. And Nancy Solomon has been a warrior in this category, and I have been her happy soldier carrying the bill. Where we are right now is still working towards what's called an agreed bill on unemployment insurance reform generally. This remains on the table. This remains an issue that I am committed to. I sit on the subcommittee on unemployment insurance and do so specifically to be able to carry this issue forward as we look towards a comprehensive unemployment bill for the year. Many people, and Nancy specifically has been really great about reaching out and getting people to sign on as co-sponsors. That remains the best thing you can do. For the more people that have this on their radar, the better off we are as we get into crunch time and get close to the end. Shelley Lulkin has written, thank you for all your hard work this session and all the others. Can you tell us if the governor or fire marshal have taken public positions yet on the sprinkler system mandate? With all the problems our state has, we do not need another divisive issue on the table. I will say that I met the new fire marshal this week. I can't remember what day it was. And when I was introduced to him, I was introduced as the person who caused all that trouble on the fire sprinklers. And he said, you're not going to have that problem with me. So hopefully that's the end of that story. Jan says, is it true that the governor's office plans to privatize DJJ? And that would be the Department of Juvenile Justice. That would be the first I've heard of it. That said, the governor is a fan of privatization. I do believe our ban on private prisons would extend to the Department of Juvenile Justice as well. So, and I think that he would find it hard to pass legislation around that. That said, you know, his involvement in private prison companies in the past, and our current in terms of utilizing those companies or subsidiaries of those companies in our probation and parole divisions remains concerning, and it's something that is on my watch list constantly. The governor did do one really spectacular thing in that area, and he retained a really a most excellent director of the Department of Juvenile Justice. She's really been quite fabulous, and I'm pleased that Director Jones remained in place with the change of administrations. And I can't imagine that she would be a fan of privatization either. Sue Paston asks, can Democrats accept Rauner's couple of good ideas? Consolidate some of Illinois' many governmental bodies, adopt a nonpartisan method of redistricting, also extend the sales tax to services. Possible, offer a fair mediation process as opposed to one stacked in favor of corporations as an alternative to liability lawsuits. Well, let me say, Sue, I have been pushing for consolidation of units of local government since I got here. And in fact, it really hasn't been Democrats blocking access to that. It's those units of local government. Many of them are represented by members of the governor's party that are, you know, working very hard to block that consolidation. I am, as I said, I have been an advocate of consolidation for quite a long time, and many of the Democrats that I work with are as well. You know, simply doing that on the Evanston side, which was, you know, the Evanston Township and the city of Evanston were coterminous. There couldn't have been a more duplicative, an example of duplicative forms of government, and that took several years to get done, and to get done right in a way that we could actually make work. The Fair Maps folks have been around. That would actually have to be done on an amendment, and I believe that still is gaining some ground. That is one area that we could perhaps find some agreement. Extending the sales tax to services in a way that isn't regressive, I think is reasonable. Looking at luxury services is a good example. You know, I don't necessarily want to add another tax burden to a lower middle class family by taxing haircuts at great cuts. You know, so it has to be done in a thoughtful way. Since our tax system is already fairly regressive, we don't want to go out. We don't want to make it worse. And offer a fair mediation process as opposed to one stacked in favor of corporations as an alternate. I have to confess, I'm not clear what part of his proposals include that. That's not one that I've seen or one that I have a great deal of background in. You know, one of the things that he has talked about in terms of tort reform actually would stack things even more heavily in favor of corporate entities rather than injured individuals. And I will always stand up for the middle class, and I will always stand up for the injured worker, and I will always stand up for the folks who are smaller and weaker than those corporate interests. I don't know if we've got any more questions on the chat line. So as I said, we are scheduled to adjourn at the end of May 31st. It is possible that we could see ourselves going into some form of extended session, which would not be good for any of us, honestly. You know, once we pass May 31st, it requires a supermajority to pass our budget, and it will require more pain and more cuts for everyone. So I will continue to push for fair solutions, but I will not compromise the well-being of the people that I represent in order to get that done. Thank you for tuning in. I really appreciate everybody's attention and time, and I love getting your questions and hearing your feedback. So I'm going to head back into committees that are happening now. We're going to be working late tonight, but thank you for tuning in.